My name is Jennifer Ruskin, and I am here from Macquarie University on behalf of the Professional Learning Events Subcommittee. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you today and to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of us is for this meeting. I'd like to pay my respects to the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation and pay respects to elders past and present. In the Darug language, Wolongamaru means follow your path. Wolongamaru is the name of our office that supports Aboriginal students and Torres Strait Islander students. And Wolongamaru recognizes that education is a powerful vehicle for change. And I invite all of us to keep that idea in mind as we hear Anne's story. I'll introduce Anne in a moment, but when we hear the story of Canada's WIL journey and consider how we can take what we learn on board and adapt it for an Australian context to follow our path. So we're here to talk today to learn about national associations as policy partners and take on board lessons from Canada's WIL journey. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Anne-Marie Fannin and could you advance the slide, please? My great pleasure to introduce Anne Fannin, who is here with us from the University of Waterloo. She is the director of the WorkLearn Institute. And I guess I just want to take a moment before I turn over to her to say that the context in Canada is very different. The history of cooperative education and how it has built to cooperative education at very high levels, and specifically at the University of Waterloo. 75% of students across all disciplines, across undergraduate and postgraduate, complete the equivalent of what we would consider 4 or more paid internships built into their studies. And so just keeping that context in mind and then thinking about what we learned that we could adapt to our context. And to introduce Anne, so she is as I mentioned, the director of the WorkLearn Institute, which is researching and consulting in this space. And specifically, they consult with 31 countries and look at explore and support building partnerships and building infrastructure to support high quality work integrated learning. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Anne.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a true joy to get to spend some time with my friends from WIL Australia. As Jen mentioned, this is a story. So today I want to share the story. Sorry, my computer just did something. Of how a strong community of practice, but a relatively unknown national association developed itself into a strategic partner for national education in Canada. And so I'm so delighted to get to connect in with you. And my first slide is about the reciprocal learning that I see us having with each other. So here I am, baby Anne, pre-Botox days in 2014 at my first ASIN conference. And I wanted to share this picture because it was such a transformative experience for me. I sat in a workshop beside CJ Patrick and I heard her talk about WIL being hot and messy and not cool and controlled like a classroom. I saw Catherine online. I met Catherine and she talked about the umbrella of WIL experiences. And I learned that Australia was working on a national strategy for work integrated learning, that you were bringing in all of these industry associations and partners. And so in addition to the many wonderful humans that I met that have become my colleagues and my friends, it was a very formative experience for me because I, little baby pre-Botox Anne, was the incoming president of the National Association, which was then called CAFCI in Canada. And I had a lot of inspiration of what might be possible during that presidency that I took from my time in Australia. I shared this at a seminar earlier this morning, but I think we can proudly say that we lead the world in work integrated learning, and learning and sharing from each other is going to help us grow. So I hope that that's what I'm able to do today, to share a little bit about our journey, maybe so you don't, not necessarily for the exact same outcomes, but rather so that you can see the path and see where you might fit in that path. So I am going to go over sort of the history of our National Association very briefly. I'm a huge history nerd, but I won't spend too much time there. The foundation that we had, what happened when opportunity knocked about a decade ago and our government started to really pay attention to work integrated learning. The deliberate steps that we took to build relationships across the country and how that evolved from nascent relationships through to really strong partnerships that are still bearing fruit today. So at the time, right after I came back from my very first ASIN conference, we were a very strong community of practice, but relatively unknown outside of the world of work integrated learning. And what happened over the last decade is an evolution from that community of practice to being acknowledged as an important stakeholder within the work integrated learning sphere, being brought in as a partner, and now being seen as a strategic advisor to various levels of government as they think about how education should evolve in Canada. So I want to take you back to 1973. That is when Canada first established its community of practice. As I said, at the time we were called CAFCE, the Canadian Association for Cooperative Education. We were a small but mighty group of 15 higher education institutions, so both universities and colleges. You might think of TVET. And really, the goal of the community was to share knowledge, to share resources, to promote the value of cooperative education across the country. Now, this next story that I shared, I think is a fun one and a timely one. So, the community of practice had existed for a couple of years. But as I shared this morning, what happens south of the border in Canada always affects us. And so such was the case in 1979 when the community of practice was still being established. And we saw that in the United States, the federal government had put forward significant amounts of money for the establishment of co-op programs. And that meant that there was great interest in co-op, but that many universities were starting programs that had very short work experiences in them, that weren't being built with institutional support, that didn't really have the level of quality that we had thought was important within Canada. And so, directly in response to what was happening in the United States, the Canadian Association decided that we needed to set some national standards for what quality co-op meant. So, as I understand the story, a group of them got together with some wine and some Quebec cheese, and they spent the weekend together and they established what are the accreditation criteria for co-op in Canada. I was involved in revising the accreditation criteria a year or two ago, and I can say that for the most part, what was established back then in 1979 has still held true today. And so some of those components that were really core to the definition of co-op was that it was paid, that it was 4 months in length, and that students would be available year round. And what this did way back then was establish a standard of interoperability such that an employer within Canada recognized co-op as a model, and they could hire students from universities in Newfoundland and universities in British Columbia, and the students would be available all for the same length of time, roughly the same guidelines behind how the program worked. And I'm leaving this here with you today because it's an important little seed that was planted back in 1979 that we'll come back to later in our story. So I'm going to fast forward all the way to 2016. I have just started my presidency with Kathy, and the most incredible thing happens. The federal government in Canada has a budget announcement where they have put aside $73 million to help fund work placements, and they use the word co-op in it. And everyone was so excited. There hadn't been any attention nationally towards work integrated learning for 3 decades. There I am sitting, chairing the board meeting, and everyone is saying, we need to get in front of this federal government department. We need to tell them that we're here to help. And I said, I am on it. And I picked up the phone and I phoned the government representatives responsible for the program. And I said, we are elated. We are here to help. What can we do? And they said nothing. They said, you can promote this program to your students. Thank you very much. That is all we need. And that meeting left me with an understanding of two things. First of all, they didn't know or care about CAFKE as a national association. But on top of it, they didn't really see the value of higher education in work integrated learning. They thought they were really building a program that was just giving students an opportunity to work in industry. And so this announcement and that very quick refusal sort of set the stage for how we responded and what we did next. We knew that we were going to have to build some relationships. It was very apparent that people didn't know CAFKE, didn't see the value in having a national association support this kind of work. So the first thing that we did is we established a formal government relations committee, and we assigned representatives from that committee to meet on a monthly or bi-monthly basis with all of the federal government departments that had anything to do with work integrated learning in Canada. So the big one that had just funded this program was called Employment and Social Development Canada. We set up monthly meetings with them, but all sorts of other departments like the Public Service in Canada, that would be the organization that brings in all of the new talent. The federal government was the largest employer of co-op students, setting up regular meetings with them. Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, because there were regulations and guidelines that related to international students that affected work integrated learning, so on and so forth. So we gathered this committee and we assigned people and we said, phone them and set up meetings with them and don't take no for an answer. The other thing that we did was we started to build relationships with significant industry associations. So the program that I had just shown you about, the student work placement program, that 73 million, was going to be distributed through industry associations. And we knew that if we were going to have influence, we would need to build relationships with those industry associations. This is my cold call letter to the president of Electricity Human Resources Canada, which was one of these funding partners for this program. I messaged her before I put this up and said, is it okay? We have established such strong relationships with them that their VP sat on the CEWIL board for many, many years. We continue to do all sorts of pilots with them. They are now one of the funded partners of our large national projects in Canada. And you can bet that the first thing we did is said, how do we fit work integrated learning into this? And so again, these were relationships that didn't exist at all, but that we felt were very critical to advancing this work. And so we just picked up the phone or sent out the email and said, let's have a conversation. It wasn't always a positive response, but by and large, over years, we established trust and we really have built close relationships with the key industry associations in Canada. The other thing that we had to do was rebrand. So CAFKE, as the Cooperative Education Association, was seen as too niche. There were, of course, many higher education institutions in Canada that didn't do co-op, and the government is always concerned about ensuring equal representation across the country. And so we knew that even though the association really did represent practitioners of all kinds of work integrated learning, as long as we were called CAFKE, we weren't going to have a seat at the table. So we expanded the mandate of the association to reflect the fact that we were already leading in this field. The next thing that we did, we went back to the thing that we had done in 1979, and we started to put some definitions in place and to establish some quality standards. Now, I was sharing this with Jen earlier this morning. One of the fascinating things about the fact that we have national co-op standards and definitions and quality frameworks is that education is managed provincially in Canada, which means there are no national standards for anything. But almost because of that, it gave CAFKE or CEWIL at the time an opportunity to really define what we believed to be quality work integrated learning, because it wasn't going to be happening across all of the individual provinces. As we'll talk about later, having these common definitions and common understandings of the different forms of work integrated learning is really critical when it comes to having government and industry engage with our work, so that we can give them a clear picture of what we're talking about and delineate an internship from a co-op program, from service learning, and so on and so forth. The next thing that we did is we started to take that quality framework and to discuss what it meant across the work integrated learning ecosystem. So this is a very, very busy slide, but I want to just kind of walk you through some of the logos that you see on the screen, because they all played a really critical role in developing a network together. We established very strong relationships with the national higher education associations. So Universities Canada, like Universities Australia, Colleges and Institutes Canada, Polytechnics Canada. We met regularly with them. Anytime anything WIL related came to them, they brought us into the loop to have those conversations. We connected in with the student associations nationally as well to understand what their advocacy priorities were and to think about how we could mutually support each other. As I already mentioned, we developed those relationships with industry associations, but we also have a business and higher education roundtable that has goals for expanding work integrated learning in Canada. We developed regular and ongoing relationships with them, and then of course our government partners as well. And we wrote press releases that nobody picked up. And we wrote budget submissions to the federal government when they weren't really interested in reading them. But we really did identify it as a moment to assert the expertise that we already had with work integrated learning. On the flip side, on the challenge side, coming to the federal government, making these broad press releases and statements and white papers about work integrated learning also taught us a lot about the challenges and the delicate balance of trying to represent a diversity of institutions with a single voice. So when we were just a co-op association, it was relatively easy. We had a definition, everyone agreed on it, everyone agreed on these standards. But now we were representing so many different forms of work integrated learning. Some are paid, some are unpaid, some are short, some are long. It makes it much more challenging to identify what you believe the government should be funding with so many conflicting priorities. And then I want to share this one because I actually think it's the most important thing that we did to evolve as an association. We convened all of the stakeholders. We held our first national conversation on work integrated learning in February of 2018. It cost us a whopping $16,000. CEWIL had never spent that kind of money on anything. But what we did is we brought together those partners from government, from the federal government, from the provincial government, the industry associations, the student partners, the independent business associations, and we all said we're interested in this thing called work integrated learning. How do we do it better together? So these pictures are from our first two national conversations. We actually held two in 2018. It was such a topic of conversation. We have continued to hold those national conversations every year since then. I believe it is the single most important thing that helped us become a recognized entity. Almost immediately after that, everything began to change. So, as I mentioned, we had established those relationships with Universities Canada, colleges and institutes Canada. And we learned that the federal government was starting to do some socialization on regulations for unpaid interns in federally regulated industries. So, both the federal government and any kind of industry that happens to fall under federal jurisdiction. We were immediately brought in as key stakeholders to advise on not just what those regulations should look like, but how any kind of process that engaged higher ed could work in the most effective way. So, vetting processes, what should that look like? How could the government set something up that would be easy for higher education institutions to navigate? We got our first funding, it was about, oh gosh, I'm going to get it wrong, maybe $50,000 or something like that from a bank in Canada, recognizing that CEWIL was helping to grow this idea of work integrated learning. And we were invited to Parliament to speak about experiential education and the value for learners. The following year, we were very excited. I was very excited to be invited to something called the budget lockup. About 100 people in the country get invited to the budget lockup. And what happens is you get a preview of the federal budget so you can start to write your press release. So I was sitting there flipping through 350 pages of federal budget when I found that the government was going to invest $650 million to expand the student work placement program. That was both the wage subsidy program, which was going to be expanded to students in all disciplines, but also for innovative forms of work integrated learning and for traditionally unpaid forms of work integrated learning. The next key moment came when COVID hit and everything began to shut down. I was telling Jen, our large bank RBC that gave us that investment, hires about 1,200 students a term. And we got a phone call from the head of talent acquisition, and he said, we're going to cancel all of our hires for the year ahead. And we had the federal government call and say, what do we need to do to save work integrated learning in Canada during COVID? These were the exact same diplomats and bureaucrats that I had called just a few years earlier to say, we're here, we want to help. And they said, there's nothing you can do. We had evolved from a place of not being recognized to being brought in to say, how can we introduce flexibility into the system such that we can allow our students and our industry partners to achieve their goals during this time? So we saved those 1,200 internships at the largest bank in Canada, and we worked with the federal government to introduce flexibility measures that allowed students in industry to access the funds in ways that they typically wouldn't have been able to. And they increased their investment in work integrated learning during that time as well, so that more employers were willing to take students into the workplace, even though they were balancing all of the challenges with COVID and lockdowns and so on and so forth. Shortly thereafter, we learned that that budget lockup announcement had a pocket of money for CEWIL in it. That first budget announcement was about, I think it was 16 million. We had 6 months to spend it, mostly in subsidies for students to be able to go out and work. And every single year since then, CEWIL has received about $18 million to support innovative and traditionally unpaid forms of work integrated learning. So along the way, we grew and strengthened our government relations committee. We formalized it. As I mentioned, we made sure that there were representatives for any federal department that was talking about work integrated learning in any way. We had someone meeting with them on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. We established those strong partnerships with industry associations so that we could help connect them to the students that they needed to meet their targets for their government funding. We also convened bilateral discussions on work integrated learning. This was seen as a huge win for the federal government. It's very hard for them to get provincial representatives to come to anything that's organized by the federal government. So CEWIL stepped in and we said, let's bring the provinces together and the federal government and talk about how we do WIL together. We also continued to do those national conversations. We hired a government relations firm to help us figure out how to do this work better. And we began something that we call WIL on the Hill, which are National Advocacy Days for Work Integrated Learning. So here's a couple of pictures from our first WIL on the Hill event. I'm going to try and share a video. Hopefully you can hear it. This is the Minister of Women, Gender Equity and Youth. So she was responsible for the portfolio of this funding that CEWIL received, speaking at our first WIL on the Hill event.
We're delivering on this commitment is by supporting post-secondary students to learn on the job through the Student Work Placement Program, on-the-job training. The program supports the creation of a variety of work integrated learning opportunities, post-secondary students of all ages, because they're different life journeys, and you understand that, and in all disciplines. Work integrated learning opportunities give graduates the skills they need to open the door to careers within their fields of study. And at the same time, it provides a supportive workforce that really benefits everybody. There are no losers here. Believe me, I've dissected all of it. There aren't. These opportunities also help employers in sectors where there's a growing demand to address skills and labor shortages, because we see that too. Today, I am beyond excited to report that the program has exceeded targets by supporting, get this, more than 100,000 opportunities for post-secondary. In budget 2023, our government announced new investments of 197.7 million. I'll just round it to 200. to ensure this important program continues. And further work is underway to ensure that the program remains responsive to the needs of both students, employers, and post.
Okay. Now let's see if we can progress or if it decided to freeze on me. Okay, so that was a moment. That was a moment for all of us to go to Ottawa, to ask to meet with representatives, to have those meetings taken, for them to say, we know what work integrated learning is and we value it. To have the minister come and speak and spend time, she spent an hour talking to students after the reception, was so phenomenal. It was such a feeling of accomplishment that we had been brought in and recognized as partners. I thought I had the clip where she said, thank you, CEWIL, but I didn't have it, so you get that one instead. But I just want to kind of unpack all of that journey again. So how did we get there? Well, the very first thing that we did is we established that government relations committee and formalized regular meetings with representatives. We also brought in anybody else that we saw as a key stakeholder in the WIL ecosystem, so Universities Canada, the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations, the Business Higher Education Roundtable. We made sure that we showed up consistently, not just when funding was available. There were so many years where we thought there was an opportunity and then no, there wasn't an opportunity. We went to that budget 2019 lockup and I thought maybe CEWIL would be mentioned in the budget. It took 2 years after that announcement before we learned we were getting any of that money. We also helped government understand how to navigate higher ed because they had shown an interest in work integrated learning and they really wanted this program to succeed. We worked very closely with the bureaucrats to give them feedback on the funding envelopes, to help them understand what was working well, what needed to be tweaked, and how they could achieve the goals that they were hoping to achieve with the program. I know you have this with WIL Australia. For us, one of the huge success factors was that we represented the nation. It's very hard sometimes for government to get to Northern Ontario or Quebec, which has a very different education system, and to understand how different institutions differ in their programming and their student body and so on and so forth. And so they saw us as a reliable, easy partner to help them figure out how to do this work they wanted to do. As I mentioned, I really do think the most important thing we did was convene those work integrated learning stakeholders through our national conversations, and then to continue bringing WIL to the agenda, to the mind of politicians through our national advocacy days. A lot of this I've already talked about, but what did relationship building look like? Well, it was those regular meetings. It wasn't tied to funding asks. It was helping industry and government navigate higher ed. We did a lot of support of requests for data. We started doing data pulse checks across the country, helping the government understand what the employment rate was like, where students were struggling, things like how long an international student had to wait to get their co-op work permit. We helped them, as I said, navigate the nuances between Northern Ontario and Eastern Quebec. We showed up. Sometimes they wanted us to bring students to events for them, and we would help them come and make sure there were lots of students at a work integrated learning related event. We stayed engaged across multiple government levels. And as I said, bringing together federal and provincial was really well received because they don't naturally interact with each other as much as they should. We shared our ideas, our feedback. We collected feedback nationally on the program so that they could use it and iterate. We had a lot of patience, a lot of broken hearts, a lot of moments the minister was supposed to come and didn't come. A lot of times something looked like it was going to happen and it didn't. But slowly, over the course of about 5 years, we built up that trust and that credibility as an association. Since 2021, CEWIL has received about 18 million Canadian dollars per year to fund innovative work integrated learning experiences. It now has a staff of 16. This is mind-blowing. When I was the president of CAFKI, we had an operating budget of $100,000 a year. Everything was volunteer-driven. Everything was done off the side of someone's desk. The fact that there is a staff that we are able to coordinate the national conversations and set up the advocacy days and do our PD and so on and so forth. It's, as someone said to me this morning, it's another universe. It's another universe I couldn't have imagined. And as I shared, we continue to host those national conversations, WIL on the Hill days. And we've since evolved to having regional conversations. So in each province or sort of general area in the country, we are convening the key stakeholders engaged in work integrated learning. If you want to ever learn more, I'll pop the link into the chat. This is the CEWIL iHub. So it represents all of the projects that have been funded by the federal government. And I actually think it's fascinating to kind of flip through and get inspiration of the different kinds of work integrated learning. One of the most gorgeous things about this funding from the government is it doesn't follow traditional government regulations. So CEWIL is able to fund a student buying PPE for a practicum. They're able to fund technology, so buying someone's laptop or tablet, or buying resources for WIL projects, or transportation or childcare. So many of the kinds of barriers that prevent our students from engaging in WIL, this pocket of money specifically for CEWIL addresses those kinds of challenges. And we continue to engage with government. So we have become a trusted advisor to several federal government departments. Very importantly, work integrated learning continues to be funded even in austerity budgets, which we have seen for the past couple of years. There has been almost no funding for higher education. again, because it's mostly provincial, but at the federal level, the kinds of federal investments that have typically been made haven't been made over the past couple of years, except for work integrated learning. We have been advocating intensely and passionately that we need continued funding. The envelopes that we've received have been kind of a year at a time. So that's been our advocacy goal over the past couple of years. Most recently in budget 2026, we just learned that we have received 3 years of funding. So it's about $600 million for work integrated learning. Again, CEWIL will have a pocket of that money. But I wanted to share not that, but the comments. So in the most recent work integrated or WIL on the Hill trip, it was one of the most inspirational moments for me because something felt like it had really shifted even further. And we went into these meetings, and you're meeting with a member of parliament that has so many other things on their plate. Number one, they bring their intern to the meeting. And number two, they say things like, you don't have to convince me that work integrated learning is good policy. Or SWIP, the Student Work Placement Program, is our crown jewel. I sat in the Minister of Finance's office and they said, we know this is what we need. We know we need more of it. So after the budget announcement, the minister responsible for the program phoned the executive director of CEWIL, and I'm paraphrasing with permission. CEWIL is a national leader in WIL and was an important part in making this funding a reality. We have many projects that we will need CEWIL's guidance for, and we need you to know that this matters and that the Prime Minister is a huge supporter and believer in work integrated learning. Again, that moment is something that I couldn't even have imagined would have happened a decade ago when we were desperately phoning, trying to get at meetings, trying to get invited to the table, trying to express to the government and to other industry associations that we had this expertise and that we could help them. It wasn't always easy. You probably just picked that up. I feel like my job was just trying to hack down the bushes so that we could try and get the next presidents to have that meeting, to have that conversation. But some of the lessons that we learned along the way, first of all, we did own this space. We were the experts in it, and I think we were a little afraid to assert that at the beginning. So we recognized that no one was going to listen to what we had to say unless we were there to show them that we had value. And so we started to learn to claim the space that we already own. Sometimes we had to plug our noses along the way as government thinks about funding things that might not be the thing that you think they should fund, or it might not look the way that you think it should look. And we had to find a way to support government but maintain our integrity. So when we put forward our proposal for iHub funding, we made sure that we weren't suggesting anything was going to be funded unless it aligned with our quality standards. It doesn't mean that everything that's funded in Canada aligns with our quality standards, but for our work and for our purposes, that was very important. Data was so useful to us, and being able to do those quick pulse checks and turn around data for the government was very, very helpful. Navigating those government processes can be exhausting. Such a learning experience to try and figure out how things actually happen and who you need to talk to and how long it takes for something to happen. And then probably the most important piece is that the work never, ever, 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 ever stops. It's still mind-blowing to me that people know who CEWIL is, that CEWIL is invited to the table in the way that we are, but the relationships are always changing. The government is always changing. Staffers come and go, and you think you finally have an in and you finally have an understanding of how something works. And then this literally happened to me yesterday. I've been reassigned. It was lovely working with you. That was 3-4 years of building a relationship, and you're back to square one. So it's a lot of work, but I think that the outcomes are well worth it. And at the end of the day, the success factors are the things that help us all succeed in our day-to-day work. Persistence, relationships across the entire ecosystem. As I mentioned, the parallel that I really see is the national reach, the fact that WIL Australia has such a strong presence. I think, is it every institution in Australia? University is a member of WIL Australia? No, no, close. Must be close. Anyway, Jen, I see Jen smile. Okay. You can tell me after. But anyway, we don't have every member by far in Canada, but we do have reach across the country, and that helps the government understand the different regional nuances, those data pulse checks, and then convening people, having those national conversations, and having people understand who we are and what we stand for. So, what can national associations do? I don't think this is a story of Canada. I really don't. I appreciate that we have been existing in a budgetary world that doesn't translate around the world, but any national association can build sustained, ongoing relationships with government. You can help government understand the complexities of higher education. You can represent that unified higher ed voice. That's hard, but very important to give the government a couple of things to pay attention to. You can invest in, and I know you have done this, credible national evidence. Your graduate outcome survey data is something we dream of having. You can engage industry as partners, and you can act as that convener. And so that's my wrap up with some questions back to the group. I'm so excited to dive into the conversation. And where are you in this journey, and what leadership space do you already own? Who has relationships with government right now, and what level of relationship is that? And my last question is, how is industry a part of the conversation right now? So maybe I'll pause there. Jen, I'll let you take it, and we'll see where the conversation goes from here.
Excellent. Thank you. Please join me, everyone, in thanking Anne for an amazing presentation, inspirational, so many things to think about and directions that we can take on board. At this point, Anne, may I suggest that you stop sharing, and
Mhm.
may I invite everybody to turn on their cameras and we can have a conversation. Anne has put some questions in front of us. And so I would love for us to have a conversation around how we can take what Anne has shared on board and think about what are some steps that we could do. But I also recognize that some of you may have questions you'd like to ask or share some challenges you've faced on things that you've tried, maybe that are relevant. So I guess at this point, I'll say if you would like to add something to the chat, feel free. But I also feel like we have about 10 minutes that we can have a conversation, so people should feel free to speak up.
Hi. Hang on.
Leonie, over to you.
Hi, Anne. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you. Um, I think from WIL Australia and when it was called ACEN, we've come along part of the journey, and I think we've always learnt a lot from CEWIL, and we were lucky. Judy Kay was president for 10 years, and best buddies with Nora McRae, so that always helps. So there, we learnt a lot along the way. I think some of the challenges like you've experienced is that consistency with our relationships with the government and who's in power and what's important, and just having to ride those waves, but trying to be very strategic and forward thinking about how we tackle it the next time. I think, like you said, in 2015, we had a national will strategy, which had government departments and industry associations. So we hit a bit of a wall in 2023 with the next version, which didn't get over the line. There were other things that were more important, so it's still gathering dust. But I think strategically from the board. I'm no longer a director on the board, but I'm still very much involved in lots of the committees. It is just this very strategic consistency, keep going, and trying to ensure that we've got that continuity of expertise and push at the national level. So, we always look with envy at some always the money, the funding, and what it is that you can do, but also about your resilience and persistence in moving it along. So we thank you for doing the hard yards in the first place, and we'll keep trudging along and see how we go in sometimes as you would expect a very challenging
Mhm.
political environment. But
Mhm.
thank you for sharing all of that. That was fantastic. Thanks a
Thanks,
lot.
Lizzie. And the one thing that I might say is that we treated government relations differently than we treated other committees in CEWIL. So CEWIL is typically like, who wants to be on the marketing committee? Okay, welcome. And with government relations, we said we need people to apply. We need to make sure we've got the right representation. In Canada, you always need some francophones on the committee. You always need people from the East Coast, that kind of thing. And so we were very strategic in a way that we typically aren't with government relations, and then putting the right people on the right file. Because somebody might be better suited they've got a huge international population, and so we need them on the immigration, refugee, and citizenship file so they can speak to the challenges they're experiencing, that kind of thing. And I think it was really important. And it's hard because everybody wanted to be on government relations because it was the flashy, like you get to go to Ottawa and go do advocacy. And it feels not as inclusive as we try to be, but we needed to really be strategic with it.
Thanks.
You, does anybody have any questions, other questions they'd like to ask or comments? I'm wondering, and you talked about going from being a volunteer-led organization to having 16 staff members. And I guess I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about how that growth happened, like, the cart before the horse kind of question, like how do you build the momentum before you have the staff, or do you sort of recruit some people? Do you know what I'm asking? Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do think it was a little bit of serendipity that there were a couple of us that really loved this work and became very good friends and very much learning from each other as so kind of a series of presidents in a row. And so we pushed, it was a second full-time job for me to lead the association, and all those emails were sent on Saturday afternoon and so on and so forth. And so it was really believing that the opportunity was worth it and being there to support each other that I think was critical. And now we have this odd inverse challenge of how do we make sure we keep volunteers engaged in the association, and how do we keep the spirit of the community when you've got paid staff to do the work. And it's not perfect at all to have, staff running some things that have traditionally been driven by the community.
Excellent, thank you. And then another one from me. Oh, no, I'm going to turn over to Michelle Morris. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Anne. That was actually really, really interesting to hear just how similar but different and aligned, but, all over the place the journeys are across different countries. My name's Michelle. I'm from the University of New South Wales and the head of the Co-op program scholarship at New South. So it's one that follows a very similar line to some of the co-op programs out of the States and out of Canada, but uniquely has that scholarship associated and being 4 years. So a really tight, sometimes quite difficult to navigate structure. And so I'm actually really interested in how those conversations with government and bringing the government partners on board, whether you had any areas that were more interested in, say, supporting technology colleges over universities, whether, you had to navigate around that as the national kind of organization, and Any hints or tips that you might be able to provide us in our unique journeys for that?
Yeah, thank you. It's such a good question, and it's definitely driven by the structure of government in Canada. So, I mentioned that higher education is funded provincially. That means the federal government can't fund universities directly, so they can fund industry. So, the large student work placement program is for industry in Canada. It started STEM. They saw the value, they expanded to all disciplines, but we have the exact same challenges with education, social work, healthcare, many of those traditionally female dominated fields, they're funded provincially. None of this money can go towards that. So that is something that we're continuing to try and push on. I guess I should say that iHub money, we can fund like some transportation for nursing students and things like that. But even then, if they're working in a provincial hospital, no. So that's been the messy part. And I think the one that I want to focus on more moving forward is getting those bilateral federal provincial conversations going again so they can think about who's responsible for what in this area. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to Alison.
Hi, Anne. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm in CQ University, and the majority of our students are spread right across the country in regional and remote areas. What are some of the tips you can give us for increasing availability of work integrated learning in regional and remote parts of Canada? What worked? And also, has that translated into an increased number of qualified professionals in regional and remote parts of Canada?
I love this question. Okay. So here's my thought slash hope right now, because we say rural and remote, same thing. It's become a big focus of the government. And I am trying to really push that we shift our funding program that it includes mobility funds for students to go to rural and remote placements. It's not currently part of the structure, but this is the kind of thing that we really want to push on. The way that it has been done up to this point in time is that the funding nationally has to be distributed across the country. And so they've really encouraged the industry associations to work with rural and remote, like TVET colleges and universities, to build relationships with partners, Indigenous partners, that kind of thing. But the question about retention is one that I'm not actually sure about. And we probably have similar challenges in that it's very expensive for housing and it's very scarce in rural and remote. And so can you get a student there? Can they find a place to live? And then do they stay? I don't know, but I'm very interested in exploring a little bit more. So maybe we'll keep in touch and I'll let you know how things evolve.
Thanks. I'd be really interested in that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you for engaging in this conversation, Anne. Before we move on to the wrap up, I have taken a couple of screen grabs for posts to LinkedIn. If anybody does not want to have their camera on or wants to have their camera off for another screen grab, please take a moment to do that now, and I'll take a final photo. Welcome to those of you who are now here. Just give a moment for cameras to come on. And hopefully everybody was saying fromage for our francophones. And so I will now share my screen for a quick wrap up. Here we go. Hopefully you are all looking now at this final slide of Anne's with how to contact her and stay in touch. So and we will share these slides. So if you're registered, you'll get these slides. And hopefully I can advance them. There we go. So we have our WIL Awards coming up that will be announced at the conference, and so anybody who has a WIL activity, a WIL partner, a WIL case study that they would like to showcase and thinks is award worthy, we would love to receive an application from you. If you are thinking to yourself, well, I have one, but I'm not sure. Please come along on the 22nd of April. This is our next event that we have, WIL Australia event, around how to submit a successful nomination. More information at that event. And then, of course, that is all in the lead up to our conference later in the year, 18th to the 20th of October in Adelaide. So please do get to the website, check that out, and please come along to the conference. And finally, if you have students doing any sorts of activities that require some funding, you can apply for or they can apply for a student scholarship, and those applications close on the 1st of May. So encourage anyone to apply who needs that funding. And with that, I will say another huge thank you to Anne for coming and sharing insights from Canada's journey. It's invaluable for us to hear. I can already imagine how this is going to be transforming conversations that we will have in WIL Australia in general and with the board over coming months. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming along to participate, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. I hope to see you at a WIL Australia event very soon.